Well, happy Monday morning to y'all. And I'm sitting here, it's a little later in the day than it usually is when I do this, and so I got some light coming in the windows instead of doing it in the wee hours of the morning before the sun comes up. But this is about those times whenever, and everybody that's ever worked on anything knows of a time whenever they didn't realize until after a job was done that they had done something wrong or that they had missed something. And that is something that we have to, you're a whole lot better off to own up to that than you are to let it pass and try to act like, hey, that had nothing to do with me. There are some times when customers bring vehicles back and it wasn't our fault. I'll be the first one to admit that because I've seen that a lot of the time. But I have actually had people also, this one guy had me replace it was actually a car that belonged to the dealership. He had me replace the wiper blades. It was a dealer transfer car, 92 Taurus. And a couple of days later he came back and said the wiper motor was making a noise after I changed the blades that it wasn't making before, like he was trying to hang that on me. You know, of course it had a bad wiper motor and the car had 362,000 miles on it anyway. And that's an accurate number. I didn't just say that to be funny. But this is an email I received about one that somebody else had worked on. This lady took her Honda in for new rear rotors and brake pads at a chain service, and she didn't say what chain service it was. She said she don't usually take her car on the freeway, so because she didn't need to when she commutes to work for whatever reason. I don't know what that meant. But on the freeway, the car wouldn't go over 50 miles an hour. She pulled over to the side. She smelled something hot. Took it to the dealer. They didn't find any error codes, so she drove home. I thought it was kind of silly that they pulled codes to see what was going on with the burning smell, So she said this past Tuesday the same thing happened, so she took it back. So the service manager went on a test drive with her, and the car did the same thing. It wouldn't go very fast. The burning odor filled the car. He said the brakes were getting hot. So she took it back to the dealership, and they found out the brake fluid had been contaminated with engine oil or some kind of oil. Somebody may have poured power steering fluid in it or something. That national chain store was the last shop that had done any kind of brake work, and it turns out the new rear rotors weren't new, the pads weren't new, the damage they caused with the oil required the brake system to be rebuilt. All those rubber parts swell up in there, and the brakes don't fail, it just locks them down to where they won't go. It's typically what putting oil in there does. And it just makes a mess out of everything. It's a real expensive repair. But the thing about it is, this kind of thing can happen when shops hire people that hadn't been properly trained. There's a lot of people that talk a good game and can come in there and have a toolbox and say, hey, I can do this and that. There was one guy that I worked with that came into the Ford place, and he had a toolbox, one of the biggest snap-on toolboxes I've ever seen. The toolbox was brand new. The tools were brand new. Every tool in that box was brand new. Looked like it had never been used. And he knew just enough about working on cars to make a mess. And he pulled a Mustang in over there to do some kind of work on it. And then they, since we had very different service classifications, they handed me a ticket on that same car, and I pulled it in there, and one of the solenoids that was hooked to a bracket, I don't remember which solenoid, it may have been the EGR solenoid. Anyway, it was swinging by the hoses and the wires, and it wasn't bolted up to where it was supposed to be. And I said, hey, why did you leave this solenoid swinging by the wires and the hoses instead of putting it back where it goes? It's just one bolt. He says, well, it was that way when I found it. Like that's supposed to be okay. I mean, leaving it the way it was when you found it is not the way you're supposed to do the job if you're working on cars for a living and you're trying to do it right. But according to other details I received about this lady's Honda car, she didn't know about it for about 6 weeks. Of course, that gave plenty of plausible deniability to the shop that she feels like caused the problem. And she was really disgusted about that whole situation. Now this executive that was driving a Crown Victoria that actually is one of the college administrators, He had a high mileage Crown Victoria he was driving. It was like a 2001 model. And he noticed the temperature was running a little hotter than it should, and then he saw some coolant under the front of the car, and so rather than bring it, the main campus was on 15 or 20 miles from, where the place was, where my shop was, campus department for automotive. And so he took it to a local tire shop where the college had some of the work done. They'd have oil changes and stuff down there. And they told him the intake manifold was leaking coolant. Now, the original intake manifold, this coolant passage right here that you see, was plastic. And it was not uncommon for it to leak coolant. As a matter of fact, when he had it into our place for inspection and for service, I told him that we needed to replace that manifold because those like to leak. And he said, well, we'll do that next time it comes in. And so the car ran great except for that, and it wasn't leaking yet, but I told him it was liable to start any time because, we replaced a bunch of these at the dealer for that. So anyway, he goes and they put a manifold on it. They tell him it needs a manifold. He gives them the go-ahead. They drove it into the shop. They replaced the intake manifold. And then, lo and behold, they called him and told him that after they replaced the intake manifold, it needed an engine because the engine was locked up. So how do you lock the engine up while you're replacing the intake manifold? Even if you overheated the engine, it wouldn't lock up. Now, if you ran the oil out of it, it would, but because of coolant, you don't see an engine lock up because it gets too hot, unless a bunch of coolant goes in there and gets on top of a piston, and that piston comes up and cannot compress that water, and it bends the rod bad enough so that whenever you're turning it through, the piston comes down and it makes contact with the crankshaft counterweight. That's what was going on here. He had the car towed over to my shop at the campus, 20 miles away, and we investigated this, and I got an engine from LKQ for $1,300 or something and put that in there, got it going again. And after this car and another Crown Victoria and a Taurus were auctioned off by the college, and I paid $3,500 for all three of them, and then I sold them for a little bit of a profit. But anyway, that situation there was kind of crazy, where you drive it into, you ever heard this funny little joke about drive them in and push them out? Well, we drove that one in, the tire store did, and when they were through, the engine was locked up, and all they were supposed to do was put a manifold on it. They must have got some coolant down in there somehow, which doesn't make any sense because it was number 8 back there on the back. Now, there's no good excuse for letting a battery that looks like this leave your service bay, one way or another. Customers ought to be willing to take care of this. One of the things that I always enjoyed doing with these to start with, before I pulled the terminals off and cleaned them, was I would get some of that CRC battery cleaner, and I would just spray the whole top of the battery and spray those two chalky terminals really, really good, and then I would pull it around behind the shop on the slab, and I would fire up the pressure washer, and I would just pressure wash that battery, and you get rid of all of that nastiness and all that junk, and then you can pull the battery terminals off and brush them and clean them or replace them if you need to, because a lot of the times when one gets this far, it's already melted the metal away, so you're just about going to have to either put a new cable or a new terminal on that thing. But this should never leave looking like that. The Ford dealer over there used to have a checklist that we would go through on every car, and you were supposed to pay attention to what, if anything needed service. It sort of protected the customer from future breakdowns. It protected the shop from missing anything. Well, this one smart aleck guy just would check off all of those papers because he felt like there was no problem anyway. He had to do some work on the inside of the car, never opened the hood, but checked off every box just like he had. And what happened whenever it wouldn't start because he had left the interior lights on or something, and when they went and opened the hood, there was a huge squirrel nest on top of the battery, and he had checked off that he had checked the battery terminals and they were clean. Busted. But anyway, it's really important to have a look at everything and try to, anything safety related, particularly where they could down the car like this, needs to be dealt with, or the customer at least needs to be told about it, but the battery terminal should be cleaned one way or another. Now you shouldn't have any of these left over. I had to pull the instrument cluster out of a Ford Probe one time, and it had 33 screws in a bucket or a magnet tray right there. And if you've got screws left over when you're putting it back together, then there's something you missed, so it's always a good idea to do that. Now this is one where the customer said, my car developed a gas smell after I installed my new amplifier. Well, you go through here and into the gas tank, you're going to wind up with a gas smell. That's just the way that is, Now this one here, the technician missed something that should have been obvious, sold an O2 sensor the customer didn't need, and then he went and he noticed that this PCV closure hose was not in place. That's unmetered air getting in there. That tricks the map sensor into not putting, not delivering the right signal. Not as much fuel goes in there, throws the fuel trims out of kilter, and he just naturally assumed it was an oxygen sensor because he threw the part at it. And how many people will take that oxygen sensor back off and put the old one back on there when they find out they sold them something they didn't need, And so there's a lot going on there. Now when you pull the hubcap off and find this, there's somebody that really didn't know what they were doing. It amazed me though how many times I saw students put lug nuts on backwards like this. And the open-ended ones, that are open on both ends. I don't remember a time in my life, ever since I was a little bitty boy around my dad working on vehicles, I always knew which way lug nuts went on. But I could sit here and watch these students. Sometimes we'd have recruiting, days where people would come through from the high schools, and I'd give them an impact wrench, and I'd have one of the trainer cars up, and I'd have 4 impact wrenches, and I'd let 4 of them race to see who could pull the tire off and put it back on the quickest. And I had a whole bunch of extra lug nuts and lug studs and all, because they're going to mess them up. Some of them wanted to put the lugs nut in the socket and just ram it on there. That's just crazy when people try that. You can get away with it a few times, but sooner or later you're going to cross thread one and just ruin everything. Anyway, I would watch them screw these lug nuts off, pull the tire off, put it on the ground, pick it up, put it right back on, and immediately start trying to put the lug nuts on backwards like this. That just totally boggled my mind. I never understood that unless they thought it looked better with this side of the lug nut out. But that's just amazing. When you find this after you replace the fuel pump, there was this Pontiac Montana, I think it was, it came in there, and it would not start. Fuel pump wasn't running. Well, my rule of thumb on that was, you go to the fuel pump relay, you find the terminal that's going out to the fuel pump, you connect your test light to the hot side, you touch the terminal of the relay terminal that's going out to the fuel pump, they're in the fuse panel relay box or whatever, you should see a ground there. If you don't see a ground there, you kick the gas tank and see if it gets a ground. If you kick the gas tank and it gets a ground, then that typically means your fuel pump needs to be replaced. Well, we went through that on this, and I kicked the gas tank, or had somebody do it, and the light came on, and I said, well, but when we investigated that, we went ahead and pulled the tank, it had a brand new pump in it. I said, well, somebody's already replaced the pump, so this is something else. Well, this terminal here is right above, as I remember, the left rear wheel in the wheel well. And all of that water and all that moisture had caused all this corrosion. And there are several GM cars that have connectors like this that go actually, there's a, let's see, this one it seems like snaps into the hole in the body and it's fixed, and then this one plugs into it. One way or another, all of this chalky junk had to be cleaned out of there. Sometimes you actually had to replace the connector with all of its terminals and everything. That's a little aggravating to get, but it takes that to fix it right, unless you're going to, bypass it by soldering and heat shrinking everything. And I despise that kind of job unless there's no other way. Now, if you're the last person to change the oil, and the next guy finds out that the oil drain plug is stripped, here on the steel oil pans, this plug is softer than the nut that's welded on the inside of the pan, right? So if you actually, or if you break this lug nut loose, or lug nut, I'm sorry, if you break this oil drain plug loose with your wrench, and it won't screw out of there with your fingers, but you have to screw it out with a wrench, that means these threads are starting to stretch, and you basically need to replace that plug so that it'll screw in and out with your fingers, because this situation is coming. I have actually seen one or two where that oil drain plug wouldn't do anything but turn round and round. You could not get it out of there, and we actually had to get another oil pan for it. That doesn't happen very often, but this is something nobody should find whenever they go behind you after you've done an oil change. The torque spec on an oil drain plug is usually from 17 to 20 foot-pounds. It's not that much. And make sure you're turning it the right direction when you go to take it out. I had one student that was pretty intelligent, but he had trouble with righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, and I went over there and he was turning the drain plug to the right around and around, and he hadn't pulled it out yet, and I said, "What are you doing? You're turning it the wrong way." And by some miracle, that thing came out of there. I didn't expect it to, but it did, and it was one of the college cars, one of the Crown Victorias. Well, this one here quit after a year. I got called to the write-up area to look at a Crown Victoria. The service manager was out there doing some kind of tap dance. The general manager, the guy that was the boss, he was out there with him, and he sent for me because he didn't like the way the service manager of the time was tap dancing. And so he said, "I want you to look at this and evaluate what this guy's saying and see if we caused this." I says, "Okay, let's see what's going on." And the guy said that this module had been replaced because the car quit. Now, it had been a year since we worked on it, but the general manager of the dealership I was working at was not interested in trying to get away without paying for anything. He just wanted to know the truth. The service manager at the time hadn't been there all that long, and he was trying to tap dance around and get out of something. That's why the general manager sent for me. And so I went out there and I looked at it. Another shop had replaced the TFI module. The customer had the original module in his hand. The original module's base plate, this plate right here, was torn loose from it. Now, it wasn't torn loose bad enough where it wouldn't run to start with, but whenever the car quit and the other shop had to change that module, I noticed the module, this plate was separated from this body. And whenever I went and looked up the vehicle in our files, and the last person that had worked on it was a guy that was kind of wild and crazy down there that did a lot of line mechanic work. He had replaced the intake manifold gasket on that car, and a lot of people, when they're setting the timing, you have to pull the distributor out to do that. But when you're setting the timing on one, people will put a pry bar down here and try to pry on the distributor, and they'll pry against that module, and they break the module. And so I went back and told the big boss man, I says, "Look, we broke this thing." And I said, I saw the name of the guy that worked on it, and I knew good and doggone well, the kind of work he did back there. And so I told him, and so the general manager gave the guy his money back for the module and for the labor the guy put it on there with, because he just wanted to know what the truth was, And this diesel radiator fan, back in the 90s, we had a guy that did a lot of the Power Stroke diesel work, and this is like the late 90s. And he tended to leave things loose because he was always in a hurry. But when you switch a diesel off, that thing stops. The compression causes it to stop real suddenly. And he had screwed the fan on, but he forgot to tighten it. And it came off so that it wound up going through the radiator. He went, when he found out that's what had happened, and on the back of the work order, when he wrote it up, he said he had removed and reinstalled the fan. Well, he went and got the work order out of the file cabinet and tried to mark out the place where it said he had removed and reinstalled the fan to try to get away with that like it wasn't his fault. But I had seen that guy leave other stuff loose too, so I mean it was, one of those things where he should have just said, "I messed up, I left the fan loose, shouldn't have done it." And, all right, this Banker's Lincoln, this is one I worked on. I had to put a CD changer in this thing, in the trunk. Back in those days, you had a CD changer in the trunk, that you could control it from the radio, which CD you were going to listen to. And I had to pull open the back door, pull the back seat out. And the back seat had this steel bracket on it where it bolted in there. And somehow when I was taking that big cumbersome seat out, I bumped into something that was behind me because I didn't have enough room back there. and I scratched the paint, right? I mean, I did not like what I saw there. It wasn't down to the metal, but it was an ugly scratch that wasn't going to buff out, right? And so what I did was I called the fixed operations manager, showed him what had happened. He brought the banker and showed the guy. The banker said, I'm not worried about it. I'll just take it like it is, and if I don't think I can live with it, I'll bring it back and we'll have the body shop fix it. But see, that was full disclosure. You know, I messed up. This is what happened. You know, and I didn't get in any trouble for it. He just had to go get the guy that owned the car and see. So we had a fully operational body shop back there. And so there was all kinds of stuff that the body shop would take care of for us if one got messed up. I was changing a battery on some kind of a little small Eagle Summit or something, and it had a real skinny Panasonic battery in it, and I didn't realize it at the time, but they put that battery in there because of the slope of the hood. Right, the battery box would take a much larger battery. So I went and told them I needed a battery for it because that silly little Panasonic battery, it was real skinny, had failed. Well, the battery they put on the counter for it, and we were the Eagle dealer at the time, which was, you know, Jeep, Eagle, Renault, all that nonsense. And the battery they handed me was a regular size battery that would fill up the battery box. And the thing about it is, the way those J-bolts were set up for that skinnier battery, they had set it up so that the J-bolt on the front would be farther back, and the hood, it would clear the hood. But whenever I put the wider battery on it, that J-bolt looked like it was too tall for the front, the way it was made, because it had a sort of a, you know, shape to it. And so I was trying to look under there to see if it was going to contact the hood, and I stuck my head under there with my flashlight, and the safety latch tried to catch it, and then it let go of it all of a sudden, and doggone if that hood didn't hit that J-bolt, and it made a little bump on the hood that cracked the paint. And so I had to go and tell them I did that, and so they took it to the body shop and got it fixed. At that same, well, within a day or so, the shop foreman, because it was going to rain, there was a car that I wasn't even working on. He pulled it into one of my service bays to get it out of the rain. It was in my way, and the reason he pulled it in was because the driver's side window wouldn't go up. Well, I was trying to work the glass up out of the door so I could get the window up, maybe, you know, put a wooden wedge in there so I could get the thing out of my service bay and use the space. I managed to break the glass, and that was nasty. So anyway, that had to be fixed. Well, there was another one that same week. The front end man, who was right next to one of my service bays, had taken a whole bunch of parts out from under the front of a big Lincoln he was working on. And he didn't put them in his service bay. He put them out there on the pavement outside his service bay. And he had all that junk out there, was never there, and I couldn't see it. I backed a vehicle, a Crown Vic or something out of there. Didn't see all that stuff, turned the wheels, and I managed to run over something he had out there and bust a tire. You know, this all, I mean, I went 5 years without messing up anything or setting a car on fire or anything else. And doggone if I didn't do those things all within one, you know, week's period of time. It seems like you know, when it rains, it pours. Well, this 2002 Camry, a student replaced the valve stem seals. I've talked about that before. We had a way of doing that here. But the engine managed to be started with the cam gear loose. This cam gear here was loose when the engine was started, and it spun out of time and it bent a couple of valves. Well, because of that, we had to remove the head to replace the two valves. Those valves on these 2.4 liter Camrys are little teeny tiny valves that look like something you get out of a lawnmower. That doesn't matter, they still got bent. Well, after we replaced the bent valves, put the head back on with a new gasket and all that, and replaced the head bolts, they're torque to yield. I mean, you're supposed to replace the head bolts if they're torque to yield, and we did. 6 months and thousands of miles later, the Camry suddenly developed an aggressive oil leak. And we found it was coming from the passenger rear corner of the head gasket, which was way back there, and this bolt right here. And that bolt wouldn't tighten. All it would do is turn around and around and around. Well, you got to remember, this was a torque to yield bolt, you know. And we had, you know, tightened it up to the torque and then went 90 degrees twice or whatever you're supposed to do. And all of that had been done, so why in the world did this happen? Well, these bolts had been replaced, like I say. The oil leak was a direct result of this failure because the pressurized oil feed to the camshaft journals and the VVT solenoid servo system passes through the head gasket right next to bolt number 8. And the only threads that could have failed were the aluminum ones in the engine block. And that block is aluminum. We're removing and reinstalling the head on this engine is a 17-hour labor charge. But if you've done a couple of them, you can beat the heck out of that book time. It's nearly not that hard. It does take some know-how, but there's a lot of little steps and tricks and a lot of bolts. And this is not a free spinning engine because it's got a timing chain. So the valves will bend if you don't get the train perfectly in time. And it had come out of time because that guy didn't tighten the bolt and started it up. But see, he's got 17 hours right there. So basically, if you look at the labor cost of today, getting the head pulled off and put it back on, which is what the dealer does when they replace valve stem seals, but we found a way to do it without that. Of course, this one here turned out to be a train wreck. Well, an hour later, Bert had the head off the car and on the bench, and we had this neat little aluminum spiral in hand that came out with the bolt. That was the threads that had been in the head. So, all right, now, so why did that happen? And it took a long time for this to happen because it wasn't leaking oil when it left. And when I told about this story one time in a Motor Rage article, this guy sent me one email after another grousing because we fixed the car technically after it was out of warranty, so to speak, But it sheared those threads because there was liquid in the bottom of that hole. And that was something he missed. There was a little bit of liquid or oil or coolant or something in there. It seems to me like it was motor oil. And this is another one. This is also something that can happen. This was on a different motor, and somebody had tightened that down. They had oil in the bottom of the hole, and it busted that chunk out of the block. And there was some diesel students that messed up one of the big diesel trainer engines, kept trying to tighten the bolt when there was fluid in the hole. I learned about this when I was I was working at that gas station in 1975, that you get the stuff out of the hole before you screw the bolt in. This guy didn't do this, and it began to shear these threads, but it didn't quite shear them until enough, heating and cooling and contracting and expanding and all that. He wound up getting that. So this was the only head bolt where the failure occurred. It didn't happen anywhere else. And if it had happened on a long trip, the engine would have welded itself together and would have destroyed the motor. We had to salvage the situation. So we use this helicoil. Now, helicoil, incidentally, makes a helicoil kit just for head bolts. You might not realize that, but I actually called the helicoil company, and they said they had a special kit that was specifically made for head bolts. Now, you got to know the thread pitch, and it's got to be the same. The thread pitch, you got to make the hole bigger with the tap, and drill it, tap it, then you put the helicoil in there, and that brings it back down to the original size, which is what you see here, and it's basically a little stronger than it was before. A lot of you guys have used helicoil, so you'll know what I'm talking about. And so that's what we did, and we put it all back together and managed to get that done. And but these people drove this car for a pretty good while after that, and finally they sold it to somebody else, and I heard that whoever they sold it to totaled it out. But anyway, well, I hope this benefited you a little bit. Have a great week. Be careful, and if you're somebody that pulls steel, make sure you do as much work as you can and turn a lot of hours. I'll see you guys next week.